Were you surprised by Artemis two's crew? Everybody was so fascinated by this.
No, I was delighted, actually. I was delighted. I'm a little too old to remember the lead up to Apollo 11, but I remember the later Apollo missions, and I remember watching the astronauts drive cars on the moon on TV when I was a kid and thinking, "Wow, that is just the coolest thing." It didn't need narration. It didn't need explanation. It was just like, "This is a dangerous thing. This is a really cool new thing. This is people going into places where we've never been, and all of that was kind of recreated with Artemis 2, right? I mean, Artemis 1 was a very successful mission, but nobody was on that rocket, right? And so it wasn't the visceral feel of, wow, people are in danger. Brave people are putting their lives at risk to test this system so that people can go back to the surface of the moon. And so that attention, those stories, those human stories, I think are what compels just general interest in our society in space exploration.
I mean, I was fascinated looking at the pictures and watching them, and I kept thinking to myself, like, what is next?
Yeah. Well, it's the Artemis 2 was a pathfinder for future missions, testing a lot of these systems, life support systems, propulsion systems, all the computers. The astronauts themselves were guinea pigs in a sense. They were the first people in more than 50 years to leave the protective cocoon of the Earth's magnetic field and get exposed to the real radiation of the sun and deep space. And so they were poked and prodded with modern medical technology, the first people to be poked and prodded with modern technology in deep space. And so, they were setting the stage for what comes next. Is what NASA has announced is Artemis 3 will be an Earth orbital mission to practice docking with the landers, the lunar landers built by SpaceX and Blue Origin. They need to get tested. And just like in the Apollo missions, Apollo 9 was a test of docking and maneuvering in Earth orbit to connect the then Northrop Grumman lunar module to the main command service module. And so it's kind of following those footsteps, iterative little baby steps. Let's test that next system. And then the idea is that Artemis 4 will send people down to the surface somewhere near the south pole of the moon where there's potentially ice resources, where there's places of daylight all the time on some of the ridges there for solar power, and where everyone's envisioning, kind of like Antarctica, will build some kind of a base to establish a foothold off the Earth.
When does this happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been asking myself that for 50 years. When does this happen? The schedule for what I just talked about, Artemis 3, Artemis 4, is over the next 2 to 3 years. That's the schedule, and obviously the engineers and others at NASA are poring over the data from Artemis 2, seeing what lessons learned, seeing if anything needs to be changed and fixed and updated, whatever. That could get pushed out, I suppose, but this administration really wants a moon landing before the end of 2028, right? And so there's
W-
pressure to do that.
Just a question that I had when I was watching and they were coming back to Earth. They were going 25,000 miles an hour as they re entered the atmosphere. What does that feel like?
Well, I mean, they were traveling, almost that fast the whole way, and you
Oh,
didn't feel anything because they're weightless, right? They're
yeah.
essentially falling in an orbit around the Earth. And so it wasn't until they started getting very close to the Earth and started decelerating and
Okay.
started slowing down, that's when they felt the G forces. I don't know personally what that feels like. I'd love to learn someday, but it's something like 5 Gs or more. So it'd be like, when your airplane lands on a short runway and the pilot hits the brakes and you're kind of, so they're all
Yeah.
strapped in and they're feeling that, 1 G or 1.5 G on the runway that we've experienced. Now multiply that by 5 or more.
Yeah.
And so, comparable probably to what fighter pilots feel on a tight turn and things like that, and so, but it's all controlled, right? The human
Yeah.
body can only take so many Gs. And so they controlled it and they all survived just fine.
They did.